Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to use interpreters and speak my talk, sorry. So what I want to share with you today is the research I've been doing looking at skilled deaf readers and how they compare with hearing readers who are matched in reading ability. And the reason we're looking at this in part is to try to understand this echo here, so it's weird. To try, maybe if I mute here, is this better? It's better for me. Is it better for whoever needs to hear me? Everyone's good? Okay. So we want to look at the neuroplasticity and the flexibility of the reading system. So one of our research questions is, how does deafness impact the neural circuits for reading? And one way to do this is by looking at deaf and hearing readers who are matched in their reading ability. And the group that we're going to be looking at in the deaf group is going to be people who are signers, who've been signing from a young age. And one reason we look at this group of deaf signers is to avoid possible effects of language deprivation on reading. So we want to look at deaf readers who had good access to a primary language early on. So that's our comparison group. And by doing this comparison, we can kind of see how do these two different groups differ in the neural substrates that support reading. Our second research question is now looking primarily within this deaf group of readers and looking at what is the neural signature? What are the patterns that we see for skilled compared to less skilled deaf readers? And I'm going to present evidence from both fMRI. So fMRI measures blood flow within the brain, and it has a pretty good spatial resolution telling us what areas of the brain are active when you're performing a particular task, like reading words. And we're also going to look at evidence from ERPs, which measure the electrical signals coming out of the brain. They don't have so great spatial resolution on where in the brain the activity is coming from, but really nice temporal precision in terms of the timing of the processes of reading. So before I start, I just want to give you a rough kind of roadmap to the regions that we know primarily from hearing readers, regions of the brain that are involved in reading. So we start at the back of the brain, that yellow circle. That's the occipital cortex, is involved in visual processing. And then as we move along the temporal cortex, that green circle, okay, we're going to hit a really important region called the visual word form area. This is a region that seems to be specialized in recognizing words. There's other specialized regions in the brain, like regions for face processing and places. There's also one for recognizing and processing words. And also a little bit in front of that region, more anterior, is a region that has been known to be involved in mapping orthographic or written representations to semantic representations. As we move to the front of the brain, that red circle is a region that is the inferior frontal gyrus, sometimes called Broca's area. And this is an area that's involved in lexical processing. And one of the things that has been discovered is there's regional specificity within that region, so that more anterior regions are involved in semantic processing, more posterior regions towards the back of the brain in that red circle are involved in phonological processing. And then the blue circle there is the temporal parietal junction. This is a region that is known to be involved in mapping print to phonology. I'm actually not going to be talking about that region too much in this talk. Okay, so let me tell you about one of our first studies that looked at reading using fMRI. We had 14 skilled deaf readers that were matched with hearing readers. The deaf readers were all native or early signers. all profoundly and feelingly deaf, and didn't use a lot of speech or lip reading. And they were matched with our hearing readers on age, on intelligence, reading level, print exposure, vocabulary, a lot of different reading measures. So these were really equally skilled readers. But they differed in their phonological skills and their phonological awareness. This particular test was developed by Miller, and your task is to decide of these 4 pictures, which 2 words start with the same sound. So here the answer is cat and kite. So you really have to know what the sound is. You can solve this test by knowing how the words are spelled. And our deaf participants scored worse than our hearing participants on this task. So really good readers, but not great phonological skills. Now in the scanner, we had them do 3 tasks to look at the different types of processing. One, a meaning-based task. So you had to decide whether a word was concrete or abstract. So concrete, can you sort of touch it or hold it, interact with it? The phonological task was to decide whether a word has 2 syllables or not. And again, you couldn't make this decision just based on the orthography. So lion and cake have the same number of letters, but lion has 2 syllables and cake has 1. And then our baseline task was, again, seeing word-like stimuli, these things called false fonts. And you had to make a decision, but the decision was pretty simple. Was it the false fonts were underlined or not? And as anybody who has sort of looked at fMRI talks, you usually see that there is a contrast condition. So we're going to compare our semantic and our phonological task with this baseline task to get rid of activations that's just due to making a decision or that's just due to processing visual stimuli that look like words. So here's the data on those tasks that they did while they were in the scanner. You can see that both groups scored very well on the concreteness decision, and there was no difference between the 2. On the phonological decision, whether a word had 2 syllables or not, that was harder for our deaf participants as we expected. So now let's look at the brain data. For the semantic task, what we found was no differences between the 2 reading groups. So both groups activated similar frontal and temporal regions to a similar degree. There were no regions that were more active for the deaf readers or for the hearing readers. So this suggests that when deaf readers process words for meaning, we don't see large differences in brain areas that are engaged compared to hearing their hearing counterparts. But we do see differences when we look at the phonological task where they have to make an overt phonological decision. Particularly, we saw a region in the precentral gyrus that was more active for the deaf readers than for the hearing readers. You can see that in the bar graph. And what we interpreted this increased activation to was that deaf readers may be using articulatory motor processes while they're making that decision about 1 or 2 syllables more than the hearing readers. And this is based on previous data from British signers doing a similar type of task where they also found increased activation in this region and where that region is in the brain. It's near regions that are involved in articulation. So it may be that deaf readers may be more likely to engage articulation in making these phonological decisions compared to hearing readers. So now let's look at those 2 tasks compared. We're going to now directly compare the phonological task and the semantic task, where regions that are more active for phonology show up in orange, regions that are more active for the semantic task are in blue. If we start with the hearing, you can see that there's no orange blob there, particularly in that frontal region. And what we suggest is that for hearing readers, when they're doing that semantic task, they're actually also engaging in phonological processing. They're maybe automatically activating those phonological codes for those words at the same time as they're making a semantic decision. And they may be doing this implicitly. They're not asked to sound words out or to think about the phonology. They're asked to make a semantic decision. But automatically, you may get phonological activation, such that then these populations that are of neurons that are engaged in semantic processing and phonological processing may overlap to some extent, and thus you don't see a difference. But when you look at the deaf readers, you can see a segregation. You can see a separation between semantic and phonological processing. And our idea here is that for the deaf readers, they're not implicitly activating phonological codes when they're doing a semantic task. They have to do the phonological task. And in this case, what we suggest is for the deaf readers, these neuronal populations may be more segregated in frontal cortex. So you can see the separation between neurons involved in phonological processing versus semantic processing. Now, if we look at the conjunction of the groups, so this is regions that were active for both the hearing readers and the deaf readers. You see this really nice, strong left hemisphere lateralization for processing words for both groups. And we also see activation, similar activation in this visual word form area there, the one that's down at the bottom of the brain. And we also saw that same activation when they're doing the phonological task. So the conjunction shows both deaf and hearing readers activate this region. So what that tells us is that activating this region, this visual word form area, does not depend on phonological skill. We didn't see weaker activation in the deaf readers compared to the hearing readers. So it's not critical to engage this region, the word form region. This leads us also to another question, which is, well, is the visual word form area doing the same thing for the deaf readers and the hearing readers? In particular, is the visual word form area tuned in the same way for deaf and hearing readers, or does this difference in phonological processing affect that tuning? So how do we ask that? How do we look at neural tuning in the visual word form area? Well, we're going to use something called repetition adaptation. And it's because this particular technique can show us the specificity of neuronal responses within a region. And I'm going to explain a little bit how that works by using an example from motion processing. So if you present people with moving dots, either let's say moving up or moving down compared to static non-moving dots, you see a particular region that's engaged in motion processing. Now, the bold signal, so let's assume that within a voxel, within a group that has lots and lots of neurons in it, suppose some neurons really respond to motion moving down. Those are the red little neurons there. Other neurons in that same region really prefer motion moving up. Which way do I have it? Yeah, motion moving up, okay? Now, when we look at the bold signal, because those neurons are all intertwined, there's no difference between moving up and moving down. The bold response is the same, that those blue bars are the same. So how do we tease apart neurons that are sensitive to upwards versus downwards motion? Well, you use an adaptation or a repetition suppression paradigm. So it turns out, if you present dots moving down one time, all those red neurons fire. Then you present that same downward moving dots again. And now the neurons respond less. They're weaker. They've adapted, okay? And that adaptation, that weaker response to the second presentation tells us that those neurons are sensitive to the direction of motion, to the downward motion. So my colleague has used this same technique with hearing readers to look at the sensitivity of the visual word form area to words. So in this paradigm, a prime word, so that's the first presentation, and a target word, the second presentation, are presented. And what's varied is whether the exact same word is presented, so in this case, coat, and then coat again, okay? Or you just change one letter, so now boat and coat, or you change all of the letters, fish and coat. And here the finding is that you only see adaptation when it's the exact same word. When you get coat and then coat again, you change just one letter. So now it's boat. Now you see the same amount of change or no change compared to when you completely changed the word. So the idea is that those neurons are really tuned to that specific word and they're not going to fire for other words. Now, crucially, when you present invented words, non-words, words that you don't have representations in your brain because they're not words, they're pseudo words, right? You can use the same paradigm, but you don't see the same pattern. So when you repeat POAT and POAT, you get the most adaptation. But now I change one letter, I still see some adaptation. It's not the same as changing all of the letters in the pseudo word. The idea here is that those neurons that are tuned to real words are sort of kind of firing when they get these non-words. And so you see this kind of graded response so that the more it looks like the prime, the more adaptation you get. So you get this graded effect. And this pattern makes sense because we don't see non-words very often. Mostly we see real words. And it's really important to make the distinction between boat and coat. They differ by just one letter. You need to know that those are different words. Whereas the non-words, there's no tuning to those. We don't encounter non-words very often. So the response is more graded based on what the physical similarities are. So does everybody kind of get this idea? I see nods in the audience, that's great. All right, so here's what we did. We again had our skilled deaf readers, congenitally bilingually deaf, early native signers, college level readers, but again, based on a separate set of tests, less skilled phonological abilities compared to the hearing people. And here's the test. First, it's important to know you need to localize the visual word form area in each individual because it's not always in the same place in each person. So we used a localizer task, which is just a bunch of different decisions to words compared to visual patterns. That allowed us to identify a region that was sensitive basically to word patterns. And then we had one scan that I'm going to tell you about today was looking at an orthographic task. So you see these words, every once in a while you see this weird string XYZ and you have to press a button when you see that string. Just occurs occasionally. But again, in the paradigm, we're doing the same thing that was done with the hearing readers, where you see a prime, and the target is always the same. For a real word, it'll be coat. You either see identity, one letter different, or a completely different word. And then for the non-words, the same kind of thing, except everything is a non-word. All right, so let's see. First, let's just look at the localization. So here we found that the left visual word form area is pretty much in the same place for deaf readers compared to hearing readers. So this is based on the data that Lori had from hearing readers. The blue and the yellow are pretty much on top of each other. And when we looked at the neural response, it looks very much like what we observed for the hearing readers. So we see reduced activation only for the identity, for when it's the same word. And we don't see a graded response. So there's no difference between getting boat as a prime or fish as a prime, right? So this is telling us that for the deaf readers, we see this tuning to real words. And we see the same pattern for the non-words, right? So we see graded adaptation for the non-words. And this really tells us that those neurons aren't caring about visual patterns. They're caring about whether something corresponds to a whole real word. And that's what they're responding to. That's the place where you see adaptation. So what does this tell us? Well, it shows that deaf readers look the same as hearing readers. And it also tells us that that whole word tuning that occurs in the visual word form area does not depend on skilled phonological awareness or on precise phonological representations. You might have thought that you really have to have precise phonological representations to match onto these whole word representations. But that's not the case, since we see the same pattern in deaf and hearing readers. So the other interesting thing we were able to see was when we looked in the right hemisphere, we were able to identify the right visual word form area in the majority, 10 out of 12 of the participants. And this is a little bit different than studies that have been done with hearing readers, where it's often very difficult to see the right visual word form area. So it can't be identified or localized in maybe less than half of the participants. In one study, it was only like 2 out of 20. So it suggests that there might be something going on with the right visual word form area for deaf readers. And because we had identified it in so many participants, we could look to see, is it tuned in the same way, or is it doing something completely different than the left visual word form area? And what we find is the exact same pattern in the right visual word form area. So you see adaptation only for word repetitions, no difference between one letter versus a completely different word, and then a graded response for the pseudo words, for the non-words. So this is telling us that both of these regions are tuned to whole word processing for the deaf readers. So we come back to my question, does deafness impact the neural circuits for skilled reading? What you'll see is the answer is yes and no. So no, when deaf readers perform a semantic task, we see the same frontal and temporal regions are engaged in reading words. We see no, the left visual word form area is tuned to known whole words in both deaf and hearing readers. But we do see some differences in the fact that we're able to localize the right visual word form area, and it's also tuned to whole words. And we see some differences when deaf readers are asked to perform an overt phonological judgment task. We see increased activation in regions that are involved in articulation. And we also see increased activation in regions that are involved in attention, in part because this was a harder task for our deaf readers compared to hearing readers. So let me move on to our second question, which is looking at the neural signatures for skilled reading in deaf adults. And I'll start with our fMRI evidence. And this is going to be participants doing the same task as I showed you in that very first fMRI study. So here we have our skilled readers, which is the data you've already seen, and now our less skilled readers that are matched for age, but not for reading ability. They had similar phonological abilities. There's a lot of variation in both groups and how well they did on this task. And I can also tell you that chance is 25%, so they're performing above chance, but definitely less than you see for our hearing readers. If we look at their performance in the scanner doing that semantic task, concrete, not concrete, high performance, but our skilled readers outperformed our less skilled readers. And on the phonological task, our skilled readers also outperformed the less skilled readers. But when we looked at the brain activation, there was no differences, at least in what the brain was doing for our skilled and less skilled deaf readers for the phonological task. But we did see differences for the semantic task. In particular, the less skilled readers showed weaker and less robust, less extensive activation compared to the skilled readers, where you see really robust activation in these brain regions that we know are involved in word processing, frontal temporal regions, more activation for the skilled readers than for the less skilled readers. We also wanted to do a correlation analysis to see which areas of activation correlated with reading skill. So either more or less activation was correlated with how well you were reading or how good your reading comprehension was. We found two regions. One was in that inferior temporal region, a region that was just in front of the visual word form area. It was a region that's been identified as mapping orthographic representations to semantic representations. That region was either more consistently or more robustly activated by the skilled readers compared to the hearing readers. Compared to the less skilled readers. So what this suggests is the more skilled readers may have more robust connections between orthography and semantics and engage this region more consistently than the less skilled readers. The other region we found was actually in the right hemisphere. This was in the right inferior frontal gyrus. Again, better readers had more activation in this right frontal region. Often in the hearing literature, it suggested that engagement of the right hemisphere, you see that in poor readers. That's an indicator of poor reading. That's not what we're finding here. We're finding that the better readers are engaging this right frontal region. We don't know exactly why. It could have to do with attention. It could be that in making this decision about concreteness, there's more attention to the semantic features that are important for making that decision, or more engagement of semantic lexical processing. We don't really know. But the key here is that it's the better readers who are engaging this region. Okay, so now let me turn to some evidence from ERPs. So again, now we're looking at the electrical signals and looking at the responses rather than blood flow and localization. And we're going to focus on one particular component of the ERP signal called the N170. So this is a negative going wave that peaks about 170 milliseconds, hence its name, after the stimulus onset. And this component is hypothesized to reflect print tuning in the same way that the visual word form area reflects print tuning. And the idea, a lot of people suspect that this component is generated by the visual word form area. In particular, you see a stronger response to words than to things like symbol strings. And in particular, this response is larger over the left than the right hemisphere. One hypothesis for why you see a larger left hemisphere response is called the phonological mapping hypothesis. The idea that it's larger over the left hemisphere because the print areas are being connected to auditory phonological processing. And the evidence for this hypothesis that you have larger N170 in the left hemisphere tied to auditory phonological processing comes from children looking at their N170 response to words. And it turns out that the children who have better, these are hearing children, better phonological awareness have a larger left hemisphere N170. You don't see that with vocabulary. It's not the case that it's just they're better at language. You see a stronger left hemisphere N170. It seems to be specific to phonological processing. And the author suggests that recruitment of the right hemisphere may actually be maladaptive or bad because it suggests that these right occipital regions, if they're engaged, they may be treating words not as strings of letters, but really as object, as pictures in a sense, which is not helpful to reading. So this is the suggestion that you get this shift to the left hemisphere as you increase your phonological awareness and you decrease your reliance on the right hemisphere picture processing. So here is our ideas. If the N170 is left lateralized in deaf readers, so if we find the same pattern as has been found with the hearing readers, and our deaf readers have poor phonological abilities, then it suggests that some other factor is driving this left hemisphere lateralization, and it's evidence actually against this phonological mapping hypothesis. On the other hand, if we find that the N170 is more bilateral for deaf readers, that would support this phonological mapping hypothesis for the hearing readers. So here's what we did. We did an ERP study with a large group of deaf readers, mostly native and early signers, matched with hearing readers on their reading comprehension, print exposure, spelling, vocabulary. So they really were matched readers. And again, our deaf readers had poor phonological abilities compared to our hearing readers. So they saw while they were undergoing EEG measurements, either words or symbol strings. And their task was to just do a familiarity judgment. So how familiar is the word for you, and symbols get a 0. And here's the electrode montage that we use. We're going to be looking just at those occipital and temporal electrodes because that's what generates the N170. So here's our results. We have deaf and hearing, words and symbol strings. The left hemisphere response is in black. The right hemisphere response is in red. And we're going to focus here on the words. And what you can see is that we get this really large left lateralized, larger response in the left hemisphere than the right hemisphere for the hearing readers, but a much more bilateral response for the deaf readers. So this actually supports this idea of phonological mapping for the hearing readers, that you get this shift to the left hemisphere because you're linking orthography to auditory phonology. That leads us to another question, which is right hemisphere involvement maladaptive for deaf readers? So these are skilled readers, but maybe this is an indication of some weakness in the reading circuit. So it turns out that no, we have evidence that it is not maladaptive for deaf readers. So what I'm showing you here, these sort of brain colorful pictures, they look a little bit like voltage maps showing you where the activation is. They're actually statistical maps from linear, using word, LME, let me just say it that way, LME regression analyses, linear mixed effects, thank you. And so what we're seeing there in the red, when it's red for the deaf readers, that's a correlation where you see the better readers are showing stronger activation. And you can see the blue for the hearing readers, it flips. And I'm showing you then the ERPs, the quartiles underneath there showing for the deaf readers, the more skilled readers have a larger right hemisphere N170, and it's the opposite for the hearing readers. It's actually the poorer hearing readers that had a larger N170. Well, you might also ask, well, are they, what, you know, how is that right hemisphere processing words? So maybe it's, maybe the deaf readers have less differentiated orthographic representations, less precise orthographic representations than the hearing readers. And you can look at that by looking at spelling. But when we ask this question, does the right hemisphere involvement mean that you have less precise orthographic representation? The answer is no, again, because we found that actually the better deaf spellers, those who have really strong orthographic representations, have a stronger right hemisphere N170 compared to poorer spellers. And we recently nicely replicated this results with a completely different paradigm, comparing again deaf and hearing readers matched on reading ability. We had, in this particular experiment, they saw a word in the center of the screen, and then they saw a word presented to the side, and their task was to decide whether the word matched or not. But we just looked at the response to the word presented in the center of the screen. And what we found was, again, a strong left hemisphere N170 for the hearing readers and a much more bilateral response for the deaf readers. And again, when we looked at the correlation, in this case with spelling ability, we saw that it correlated with the size of the right hemisphere N170 for the deaf readers, but not for the hearing readers. Again, suggesting that this is not a maladaptive response. So just to kind of sum up, what are the neural signatures that's specific to deaf skilled readers? One, better deaf readers show more activity in the orthographic to semantic interface. So that region that's just in front of the visual word form area. Skilled readers engage that region either more consistently or more strongly. We see that the visual word form area and the N170 response tend to be more bilateral. And they're more bilateral for the skilled readers and skilled spellers. And we see that better deaf readers and spellers recruit right hemisphere regions. So not only the right regions that are giving rise to the N170, but also in that right frontal region that we saw in the fMRI study. So I have time because I want to just mention we've done some very recent work looking again at differences between deaf and hearing readers. This was using what's sometimes called a mega study, meaning that you use a lot of participants. So in our case, it was almost 100 participants, half were deaf, half were hearing. A large number of words were presented, so almost 500 words. The task here was you would see individual words and it was a go, no-go lexical decision. So every once in a while there'd be a non-word and you had to press to the non-word. So you're just looking at words and every once in a while detect a non-word. And those words varied in lots of different characteristics. So differed in frequency, they differed in concreteness, they differed in orthographic neighborhood density, how many words looked the same. They differed in visual complexity, so how curved or crooked the letters were. And then what we did, or I should say, oh, I don't have Kurt's picture here. Kurt Winsler is the senior author on this, conducted these linear mixed effects regression analyses. And in these analyses, you treat each individual electrode as a single trial. And so you get a lot of data. And it also can tell you, you can control for, if you're looking at effects of concreteness, you can control for effects of frequency, orthographic neighborhood density. So you can really narrow in on the effect that you're looking at with these types of models. So one of the things we found, which was interesting, was that we found that the deaf readers in this group had earlier and larger concreteness effects. So concreteness effects in EEG experiments looking at words and sentences, you see a more negative for the concrete words compared to the abstract words. There's different ideas about why that might be. It may have to do with the number of and types of semantic features that are encoded by concrete words, but that's the direction that you see. And it was the same for both deaf and hearing. But the response was much, or the effect was much bigger for the deaf readers and the hearing readers. And it also occurred relatively early, significantly earlier than for the hearing readers. And what we suggest is what's happening here is for deaf readers, they're really leveraging information from semantic networks for word recognition. They are really relying a lot on semantic features in word processing, more so than our hearing readers. And that information is engaged or activated earlier, perhaps from more top-down types of processes from the semantic networks. The other thing we found was looking at visual processing. So we found both earlier and different effects of orthographic neighborhood density and visual complexity. So I just start with the orthographic neighborhood density. So this is how many words look the same, how many are in that neighborhood, okay? And you tend to have larger, more negativity, more things are active for words that come from a high density neighborhood than a low density neighborhood. One of the things we found is that the hearing readers actually showed a larger effect of orthographic neighborhood density, or OND. And we think what's happening there is orthographic neighborhood density is confounded in English with phonological neighborhood density. So the words that tend to look alike orthographically also tend to sound alike phonologically. And if, as we've hypothesized, hearing readers automatically activate these phonological codes, they have two networks that are going on in boosting this neighborhood effect, both the phonological neighborhoods and the orthographic neighborhoods. So you see this bigger response for the hearing readers compared to the deaf readers. Now the deaf readers were sensitive, but to a lesser extent, but that sensitivity occurred earlier. So you started seeing effects of orthographic neighborhood density at about 150 milliseconds, where it was later for the hearing readers. We also found effects of visual complexity of the word. So this is a low-level kind of visual processing. Complexity was defined by basically how many angles, how many curves or angles were in a letter. So a word like poem would be relatively complex, but a word like lull would be relatively simple. So what we found there, again, earlier effects for the deaf readers, but we also found an opposite polarity, meaning that for the hearing readers, the complex letters or the complex words, visually complex words, generated more negativity, a larger response. It was the opposite for the deaf readers. It was the low complexity ones that had the higher negativity. Or you can think of it the other way, highly complex words were less negative. Now this was surprising, so we have just kind of a little bit of a like what could be driving this. But one possibility has to do with just sensitivity. It could be that the deaf readers really are processing those visually complex words more efficiently. There's less competition compared to very simple letters, where there's lots of competition for the different visual features. So there may be this kind of efficiency that's going on for the deaf readers compared to the hearing readers, just with respect to these sort of low-level linguistic processing. So that needs more work, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And it also fits with some recent work coming out of Eva Gutierrez's lab, where she finds that deaf readers are more sensitive to the shape of a word compared to hearing readers, and it's earlier. So there's something about this early visual processing that may be different for deaf readers than for hearing readers. Okay, so my bottom line is that what all of this evidence suggests is that the neural end state for skilled reading may differ for deaf and hearing populations. So the end state that you see for hearing readers may not be where deaf readers need to be. And with that, I'll thank all of you for listening. Thank all of our deaf and hearing participants, all of the colleagues that have worked on this project, these various projects with me, as well as our funding sources. And I'll take your questions now. I hope I didn't go too fast.
First, I wanted to apologize. We didn't realize the chat feature was disabled early on in the webinar, so apologies. Next, I do see a few questions in the Q&A here, but I think we can start with taking a question from someone in the room and then a question from the Zoom Q&A. Are there any questions here in the room? You come and stand here or have the interpreters. A wonderful presentation. And it's nice to see you again. In your research, you have used signers, nearly all native signers. I'm wondering if within that group, I know you compared them to hearing non-signers, but what about hearing folks who have signed but are bimodal? And what about those who have another status, hearing status, and thinking about the effects that would have in terms of becoming an expert reader?
question. So we're actually not looking at hearing signers, but there are some studies that do look at hearing signers to see if, when they read, if there's activation of the same areas that are activated when we use ASL. So that is one study. The answer is yes. But they do pattern a little differently than deaf readers. So they don't have the exact same patterns. We don't know why that is. It might be partly that they're activating phonology in a way that deaf people don't. Then we also have to deal with the issue of language dominance. So for deaf people, sign language is their dominant language because it's one that they use 24/7, and hearing signers arguably sign less. So it's harder to know if those effects are from dominance or another source. And then your second question, was it about oral deaf? Oh, no, access to sound. So, right, typically if someone has more access to sound, then they will also access more phonology or have more phonological words, not always, but usually. And our research question focuses on what happens in the reading system when you have little to no phonological skill. So that's why we had participants who were profoundly deaf, because we knew that accessing phonological information in English would be more challenging for them. But it is a good question. You know, what does happen with that? We don't exactly know. Thanks.
There's a question that I will read from the Q&A. I will sign that if that's okay. I think it's easier if I do. So this person wants to know if you see any correlation between early language deprivation and later reading skills.
So our research, again, doesn't really focus on effects of language deprivation. For sure, language deprivation has profound effects because it has effects on language in general. But exactly what in particular it affects regarding reading, that we have not studied, but it is a good question.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from in the room? Come on down. Wonderful talk. Your research has been on adults who have already acquired language and learned to read. If I could ask you to hypothesize, knowing what we know about highly skilled deaf readers, what would you suggest or recommend to teachers or people developing curriculum in terms of what they should focus on with children at a younger age, in terms of supporting them in becoming skilled readers and supporting their processing, their learning processing? I know your research focuses on adults, but do you have any ideas or suggestions?
So one thing that I think our research does clearly show is that phonology is not everything, right? People have less phonological skill than hearing deaf people. So you have less phonological skill than hearing people, but they're still very skilled readers. So I'd say don't focus so much on phonology. But we don't know how much phonology is needed to access the system. It could be that you do need some degree of awareness or knowledge or access, and then that would lead to other strategies. So it is possible, and it is something that would need to be figured out, how much phonological awareness is needed. It might not be very much for adults. I mean, the adults that we study do, of course, have phonological knowledge. They weren't performing at chance. They were performing better than chance, just not as well as the hearing people. We've also started to do research on adults, again, looking at morphology And one idea there is that morphology really has a key role in the mapping between orthography and semantics. For hearing people, phonology can sometimes disrupt morphology. I'll give you an example of the English word to sign, S-I-G-N, and signature. I know ASL and signs are the same, but sign, S-I-G-N, and signature sound very different. The S-I-G-N in signature does not sound like sign, but they look the same. So if you ignore the phonology and focus on the meaning and the orthography, then that might help support reading development. There is some evidence for that. And we're starting to look at adults to see how their morphological processing is similar or different. So I don't have a lot because I don't study kids so much like this.
I always have questions. I think taking a step back, thinking about your first study, the adults that you studied, you had participants do 2 tasks, phonological task, then a morphological task,
Semantic task.
semantic task. Okay, so for the hearing person, there is a natural overlap in both of those areas, but for your deaf participants, you saw the IFG activated for semantics, but a separate area that was activated in terms of the phonological task. Did the phonological task involve written words? It did, right? Okay, so I'm wondering if that also inherently encourages use of English phonology and not ASL phonology. And I'm wondering what this would look like if this task used an ASL-based phonological task, and to see if you would have that same natural overlap for deaf people, for deaf participants.
So I think you're actually asking me a bigger question even than that. So does English phonology overlap with ASL sign phonology?
Yes and no. My assumption is that it does not. I don't have a lot of knowledge in terms of bilingual research and studies specifically looking at second language acquisition there, but I know there is a difference there, and there's an entirely different network for learning a second language and the way you process phonology. But I'm wondering about those who don't easily access English. Deaf people, for example, don't have easy access to spoken language and spoken English phonology if this process looks different.
So I'm not exactly sure how to answer you, but I can say 2 things. One, we do have evidence that when an English word is read, ASL phonology is activated. And that's true in hearing or deaf signers. So it suggests that there is some kind of link between English words and ASL signs and ASL phonology. And then one thing that's also interesting that we found is that there's a correlation, like how much evidence or how much ASL activation is required to read English. So when you read English, you see activation of ASL. That activation can be large or small. And that correlates with reading skills. So the less skilled readers typically activate ASL more. That suggests or gives some support for reading from ASL for less skilled readers, for single word reading.
Okay, thank you so much. Very interesting to continue to think about, and thinking about numeracy and the effects there as well.
I'd like to say one more thing, that the overlap between ASL and English phonology does have some evidence for them being overlapping and also being separate. The overlap seems to occur in the SMG, the left SMG. So you see activation for both sign phonology and English phonology in that area. But it might also be distinct within that tissue. We don't know.
Okay, thank you. I see we have additional questions from the audience here. Let me check the Q&A. Could you come down here and sign, or do you want the interpreters to copy sign? So I'm wondering about ethnic and racial backgrounds of your participants. Thinking about deaf people who come from different cultures, and I'm assuming that the literacy has been affected. I'm also wondering about the activation that you would see. So I know you had a small N. Could you share information about gender and race and more about the ethnic backgrounds of your participants?
So we typically have more female participants than male participants, and that's true for psychological studies in general, that women are more inclined to volunteer than males. And also, typically participants are white. We are in Southern California, so we do have a large population of Latinos, not as many Black participants. We do try to recruit from various sources, but we end up going with whoever we can access and who volunteers. So we do try to diversify our participant pool, but I admit that it's not as diverse as it should be or could be.
Hello. So coming back to Dr. Verletti's question about ASL phonology, I'm wondering about what research has been done specifically on ASL phonology, looking at the work that you shared as well. We're comparing deaf and hearing readers who are matched on English reading ability. And ASL clearly doesn't have a written form. But could you compare hand shapes, for example? You know, there's one study that showed coat versus boat. C and B hand shapes are very different. So for signers, I'm just wondering if there could be something replicated that would be using ASL.
We are actually doing that right now. So my colleague, Stephen McCullough, has just developed that exact stimuli. So we've got pairs that either have the same location or hand shape. And we are looking to see what kind of adaptation occurs in the brain when they see the same exact sign or a sign that differs along one parameter. So we're doing that right now. And yeah, I mean, honestly, I probably won't have the results to present in for like 2 years. So.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to that. I will definitely follow up.
I will say, though, we do have some published results already that come from ERP studies and priming with hand shape and location. We compared hearing people who are non-signers to see just what's happening visually. So they're looking for what's similar and different. But these signs for deaf people also have phonological information because they know which hand shapes are linguistic hand shapes. So we do have some evidence for that. We see that with deaf people, they are much more sensitive to hand shape earlier than hearing non-signers are. And we find some evidence from location, which is also really interesting. It seems like it's more like competitive, not supportive. It's the location and handshake seem just to have a very different function in signing and recognition. It's a little complicated, but there is evidence showing how deaf signers process handshake and location. And typically, hand shape, you see with priming, and then location, it's more about like semantic information. Like what I was saying before with the neighborhoods, orthographic neighborhood density, you see that there's sort of competition that happens with location, but not with hand shape, and then you don't see that at all with hearing people. So we are also trying to figure out sign phonology in the brain.
This is fascinating. And if you don't mind, I'd like to ask one more question. So you've mentioned this as a current future study. Will future studies also include other bilingual people, for example, CODAs or other groups of people who are bilingual? Maybe deaf people who use ASL and another sign language, and wondering where that natural overlap might be and in terms of how knowing multiple sign languages. Okay, looks like you thought about these things.
No, I was just gonna say that we have to go one step at a time. So first we work with native early signers and American Sign Language. It would be nice to see what happens with CODAs who are very bilingual. So we those for the deaf people that we study, they also are bilingual. But the problem with CODAs, first off, is that they're hard to find. They're harder to recruit than deaf people are. So there's a challenge in recruitment. And I'm not sure exactly what to expect in terms of how they would be different. So I don't quite know what to predict because they differ in terms of their language dominance, their language experience. I think if I had a good hypothesis, then I'd feel more comfortable moving forward.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you answering my questions. Back here to check the Q&A. So folks online are asking about seeing a copy of the slides. We will archive this presentation. Once we edit it, we will upload it to our VL2 website. And on the webpage, you can see this talk, all of our previous distinguished lecture talks, and that will all be available at no charge to you. And our brochure with all of the presenters for this year is also available online. There's a link there that you can use to find our webpage as well. Unfortunately, we cannot share the slides in the chat at this moment. Any other questions from the room? Can we close the PowerPoint that's on the screen? Hello, how are you doing? Good to see you. Thank you for your talk today. Two related questions. So you talked about deaf people being more affected by hand shape than other parameters, or word shape, correction to the interpretation, word shape than hearing people are. So I'm wondering what your hypothesis would be about deaf readers and their storage of memories around words. For example, I would assume a hearing person may read a word and easily forget the font that it's in, but may remember the word based on its phonology. I'm thinking about the way that that would affect them similarly, maybe to the way that deaf person might remember the shape of a word.
Can I answer that question first before I forget? So I think that for word shape, I think it's more of a low level, it's a low level visual processing. It's not a high level representation. There are some studies that look at how exact the written representation is. So for example, good spellers have very good representation. And they also look at sensitivity to transposed letters. Have you heard of these studies? Okay, so transposed letters for others in the room are ones that people won't even notice when you're reading a passage. you just automatically reverse them so that they're in the right order when you're reading. So it shows that we do have some flexible representation, and on those tasks, hearing people and deaf people perform the same. So it does suggest that orthographic representation in many ways is parallel for deaf people and hearing people. We thought that deaf people would be better than hearing people in those studies because we thought that they would be really sensitive to the orthography, but their performance parallels hearing people on those transposed letter studies. So I think that what we see here has to do more with low-level visual processing, and it's possible this is going to be interesting for hearing people, that it could be more about it changes just based on the experience of being deaf, not so much about language. That visual attention is different for people who grow up deaf. And that's my intuition about why we see that difference with such a low level of visual processing in deaf people. Now here's the question.
I'm wondering if, again, you've looked at skilled deaf readers and their phonological awareness, and that it seems those results parallel hearing people, excuse me, that they do not parallel hearing people.
So is it that maybe there's a hypothesis about hearing, that deaf people don't develop a hypothesis about sound? So let's say, for example, you show me 4 words and ask me if they, or images, and ask me if they start with the same sound. One deaf person might look at these pictures, and I've not thought about this a great deal, so I say, well, I can't guess. Another deaf person might have an idea on or about it. So my assumption would be, if, let's say, a hearing person reads a new word, I think they would probably develop a hypothesis pretty quickly about how to pronounce that word before they would ever hear it. And often your hypothesis could be wrong about how to pronounce a word. And so your hypothesis about sound could be wrong, but every time you read it, you still access this incorrectly useful hypothesis of how it sounds. So let's say that a deaf person, like their answer to the phonological task is different from hearing people, but internally to that deaf person, if it is consistent, it might just be that they have their own hypothesis about how to pronounce the words. So I was wondering if there's a way to parse out those two possibilities. That's a good question. So let me just repeat. I think the basic idea is that with deaf readers, we give them a phonological test. And it may be that there's different strategies that they're using. They might be thinking about how those words appear if they are lip reading something, or if they're trying to pronounce it, pronounce the word, versus hearing people, you can assume are sharing the same strategy, which is how it sounds. So am I getting your question? Great. Yeah, like I don't know if it would be possible that maybe a deaf person has their own consistent internal phonology, even though it's not the same as hearing people's phonology. Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think that it might not be as precise as hearing people's. There's some evidence for that. So it's a bit more muddled. And of course, is hearing people's, and that's why you end up seeing such consistency among hearing people's response, because it's so precise. But with deaf people, you see greater variation because they could be using different strategies and different interpretations. But clearly, there is an understanding of phonology because, like I said, they're not afforded a chance. So it is a matter of what you're asking, sort of understanding what is going on there. But I think it's certainly interesting. And if that variability influences anything. So far, we have not seen a big impact of phonological awareness on reading, but we haven't looked into that more deeply.
Great, thank you. I guess that's all. Anyone else in the room have an additional question? We do have time for another question. We're going to have the questions in English.
Yes, thank you for your nice talk.
Oh, I think you still need the microphone for captioning.
Thank you for your nice talk. So in the participant, there are two groups, skilled reader and less skilled reader. So is there a different for those study group, or is there a entire study group in the skilled reader? Is there any quantity?
Is there any?
How to define the skilled reader and less skilled reader?
So in our studies, it's basically a range. Usually the less skilled readers are reading around junior high school level. So how old are you then? 11, 12, compared to college level readers are our defined groups. There are some studies that look at readers that are even less skilled, third and fourth grade readers. We tend not to look at that group because often there's something else going on. And we can't then compare them with matched hearing readers. There definitely have been other studies that have looked at reading skill in deaf individuals. In fact, most of them are looking at not highly skilled readers, but less skilled readers. The problem there is you don't know if the effects you're seeing are due to reading skill or due to how they learn to read or being deaf or knowing a sign language. So we try to control for those factors and just let reading skill vary. Does that make sense?
I think it is a good time to close our webinar. Thank you to everyone who joined us virtually. For those of you who are here in person, feel free to stay. We do have a small reception happening with a few refreshments to allow everyone to talk with our distinguished guests. I know there are a lot of students here who have questions that they'd like to ask. Maybe they don't want to stand in front of the room, but they would like to talk with our presenter. So you have the opportunity to do that as well as talk with other folks in the room. Thank you to everyone who joined us virtually. We are going to close the Zoom room now. Bye, everyone.